Okay. Reverend G. William, Fellow of Hertford, said, I suppose I may as well, in the first place, declare on what side I am going to speak. Although I shall not trouble you by entering very much into the question, as it has hitherto been discussed by Mr. Miller and the Margaret professor, but I have not the least hesitation in standing up in support of Dean Burgon and Mr. Miller. It is very pleasant to cast aside labor and to disregard a number of manuscripts, confining oneself to a few. That is the principle of Lachmann, and it is in fact what we are invited to do by the school of Dr. Hort. I shall not attempt to comment upon anything which has been said by the Margaret professor, but I will express my surprise at one remark which fell constantly from his lips. Dr. Sanday constantly spoke of Aleph and B as if they were agreed in text. I thought everybody knew that they do not always agree, and therefore must not be brought as one authority. They are two discordant witnesses. Professor Sanday intervening. May I be allowed to explain? What Mr. Williams says is perfectly true in regard to the agreement of Aleph and B. Dr. Hort laid stress upon their differences and quoted them as two authorities, but Mr. Miller is glad to quote them as only one. No doubt, at a certain point, Aleph and B had a common ancestor, and it is a question how near that ancestor was to the autograph on the one hand and the actual manuscripts on the other. I perfectly allow that there is a considerable amount of difference as well, but that tells in favor of Dr. Hort rather than against him. Mr. William. I do not care in whose favor the difference tells. I want to arrive at the truth. I maintain that there is a difference between Aleph and B, and indeed between all the oldest manuscripts, and I suppose it is in consequence of these differences that an appeal is to be made to the versions. For if there were not these differences between the manuscripts, I presume we might base our text upon the Greek manuscripts only, and not appeal to translations at all. I think the importance of the versions may be greatly exaggerated. I speak from my own point of view, and the Margaret professor will not agree with me. When we have a mass of manuscripts handing down to us the text of the New Testament, what occasion is there to go to the Latin or Egyptian, or what Dr. Sanday was courteous enough to call the sheet anchor of Mr. Miller's position, the Peshitto? This is a subject which demands considerable attention and is not one to be lightly treated in half an hour. Why should I speak? I would venture to remind you that I have already written upon the subject in several publications, and it is a very significant circumstance that none has ever attempted to refute anything I have said. The sensitiveness of some people about the Peshitto is very remarkable. Having occasion to write in the second volume of the Studia Biblica, which came out in 1890, on a certain Syriac subject, I made some remarks upon the value of the Peshitto. A certain member of the university said he should be very sorry for such remarks on the subject to issue from the Clarendon press. In spite of that, the remarks did issue, and are extant to the present day. In the third volume of the Studia Biblica, I more fully discuss the question, and I may venture to refer those who are interested in the subject to an article which I wrote upon the same subject in the Critical Review for June 1896. Lachmann, I believe, said he did not know Syriac and did not mean to study it. In that he was right, for the Greek manuscripts were quite enough for the settlement of the text of the Greek Testament. Tregelles made a great mistake when he said the Syrians constantly revised their manuscripts. In cooperation with the late Philip Pusey, I set to work to discover what the truth was, and found they did not so revise them. But there is a mass of evidence carrying the Syriac text back to very early times, and supporting what the Margaret professor has been kind enough to call the sheet anchor of the position. My friend Mr. Crawford Burkitt read a paper before the Church Congress at Norwich and apologized in a private letter to me for being dogmatic on the ground that he had not time to argue the question. I cannot allow dogmatism to be on one side. I accepted the apology, and in the same spirit I shall be extremely dogmatic now, for I cannot argue the question in 5 minutes, and I say that the Curtonian and Lewis manuscripts were not the origin of the Peshitto as we have it. The Margaret professor spoke of them together as if they represented one kind of translation. If he will be so kind as to study a book which has been published by a certain gentleman I have the pleasure of seeing in this room, in which the two are compared, he will see that the Lewis and the Curtonian manuscripts were not two manuscripts of some one version which necessarily preceded the Peshitto. The Margaret professor very pertinently referred to the principle of Dr. Hort that to understand a text, we must understand its history. We can know something of the history of the Peshitto. We have these many manuscripts and can collate them and trace out the history as Pusey and I have done. May I ask those who do not agree with me to remember that I have never said the Peshitto was not preceded by some other form of text. All I say is that we have not got it now, and that the Lewis and Curtonian manuscripts were not the origin of the Peshitto. These things I state dogmatically, but I have stated the reasons and argued the point on previous occasions. It appears to me that the difference between my position and those who disagree with the late Philip Pusey and myself is this. They offer conjectures while we offer arguments. They deal in surmises while we collect and tabulate and set before the world facts. All right, Reverend A.C. Headlam. May I ask what evidence Mr. Gwilym can produce of the early date of the Peshitto and how far back that evidence will carry it? Mr. Gwilym. At least it carries us back to the 5th century, and it may be granted that the translation was not made before the 2nd century. Have you any manuscripts of Sophocles which carry you back to the date of his original writings? Mr. Allen said, in venturing to speak of the relation of the Lewis Codex and the Curtonian Syriac to the Peshitto, I do so with the consciousness that I have not made that thorough and systematic examination of the material which alone can enable anyone to speak with authority upon a matter still under debate. But since with hardly an exception, almost every writer who has discussed the question from the linguistic point of view has found reason to assert with some emphasis that the internal evidence in favor of the priority of the Lewis and Curtonian manuscripts to the Peshitto is clear and unmistakable. I venture to restate some of the reasons for the position which my own slight acquaintance with the evidence persuades me as well grounded. There is one point which I shall assume as proved, because I do not know that anyone, Hilgenfeld alone excepted, has ever seriously disputed it. That is, that the Lewis Codex, the Curtonian, and the Peshitto are three recensions of one and the same version. This, I imagine, will hardly come within the scope of our consideration today. The point that this afternoon may be considered as still open is the question whether the Lewis Codex and the Curtonian represent prior stages in the development of the Peshitto text, or whether they are corrupted recensions dependent upon it. The following are reasons for holding the former view. I have had occasion from time to time to make use of Mr. Bonus' valuable collation of the Lewis Codex with the Curtonian, and I have found reason to believe that the order in which the three recensions are placed upon his pages, the Lewis Codex first, the Curtonian in the middle, and the Peshitto last, can be justified as the historical order. The Curtonian gives us a text intermediate between the other two. As a test passage, I have selected Matthew chapter 4, 1 through 17, partly because the first 12 verses are discussed in Holsey's monograph upon the subject, partly because I had previously worked through the same passage in my own notebooks and could therefore test my results by his. I find that in these 17 verses, the Peshitto agrees with the Curtonian against the Lewis Codex about 26 times, with the Lewis against the Curtonian about 13 times. That is to say, the Curtonian stands very much nearer to the Peshitto than does the Lewis Codex. Now, is it possible that the right order is Peshitto, Curtonian, Lewis, or that the Curtonian and Lewis are two independent offshoots of the Peshitto? The latter hypothesis is precluded by the close verbal agreement of the Lewis and Curtonian against the Peshitto. The former by some cases where the Lewis Codex has a harsh or unexpected rendering which cannot be explained as an alteration of the Peshitto Curtonian text, but are intelligible if the Lewis Codex form the first stage in the series. Such are verse 6, fall from hence, altered by the Curtonian into cast thyself down. In agreement with the Greek text, arms in the same verse, which in the Peshitto become hands, verse 9. These kingdoms and their glory thou seest, altered in the Curtonian into all these things, verse 16. In sadness and in the shadows of death, of which the first word is omitted in Curtonian and is changed in the Peshitto into an equivalent of the Greek. Is that Korah? It is, of course, difficult to prove much from a section of 17 verses only, and I do not mean to say that difficulties do not sometimes arise, which it is not easy to explain. The cases, e.g., where the Peshitto and Lewis combine against the Curtonian. But every page of the Gospels confirms the impression made, as it seems to me, by the passage I have discussed, that the Lewis Codex represents a prior stage in the version, that it has been subjected to revision in the Curtonian, and that this again has been revised to harmonize with the Greek text. And this might be supported by such considerations as that the Lewis Codex gives a much shorter text than that of the Curtonian, and that cases occur where renderings in Lewis, which seem to be mistranslations of the Greek, have been corrected either in the Curtonian and the Peshitto or in the latter only. E.g., Matthew 12:25 saw in the Lewis Curtonian, the Lewis Codex, verse the Peshitto knew. John 18:4, Matthew 18:20, not verse where, I guess that's the Curtonian. Mark 10:40 for others, verse GK. Luke 4:29, hang, verse cast. And John 7:35, seed, verse places. If I were discussing the question from a general point of view, I should of course endeavor to support what has been said by the additional arguments, that the type of text found in the Lewis and Curtonian manuscripts finds analogies in such early witnesses as the Diatessaron of Tatian and the quotations of Aphraates. Further, that it often finds support in the earliest Greek manuscripts and in the Old Latin versions. But arguments of this kind open up questions which are for this afternoon debatable ground and which have been previously discussed. In conclusion, I should like to say that the argument against the possibility of the Lewis Codex being a direct link in the development of the Peshitto text on the ground of the supposed heretical tendencies of its writer seems to me unsound and dangerous. If it be true that truth precedes error, it is equally true that inaccurate and unguarded statement of truth has sometimes preceded the scientific expression of it. In a version of the Gospels so accurate and careful as is the Lewis Codex, the few expressions with which fault has been found can at most have a color of heresy when detached from their context and isolated. Until we have further evidence which will force us to conclude that the scribe of this codex was heretically inclined, it seems to be more reasonable to look upon these expressions as primitive methods of expression which were afterwards modified. Of course, I do not mean that they give us the true reading, but only that they represent a very early stage in the history of the Syriac text, and that to urge that the Lewis Codex is a corrupted recension of the Peshitto on dogmatic grounds is to misread the evidence, even if in such case it is certain that the Peshitto retains the true reading and the Lewis Codex a corrupted one. It may still be true that as far as the Syriac versions are concerned, the Lewis Codex presents us with an earlier form of text which has been modified in the Peshitto to harmonize with the Greek text. The Reverend A. Bonus, Pembroke. In the very short time allowed me, I can only make a few brief observations, referring to a moment to what has just been said. I should like to point out that in the places where the Lewis and Curtonian manuscripts differ, the latter agree or tend to agree with the Peshitto in SS, Matthew, and John many more times than Lewis agrees or tends to agree with the Peshitto in the same Gospels. Whereas in Luke, the respective agreements or tendencies to agreement between Curtonian and Peshitto and between Lewis and the Peshitto are fairly equal. This is a remarkable circumstance which demands careful attention. Connected with this, there is another point of interest. Lewis, as you are aware, is characterized in parts by the use of the word Lord instead of the word Jesus. This is the case in St. Matthew and especially in St. John. I am speaking, of course, of those parts only of Lewis and Curton which are available for comparison. But in St. Luke, the case seems reversed. Thus, whilst in St. Matthew and St. John, Lewis inclined to the use of Lord and Curton to the use of Jesus, in St. Luke, Lewis inclined to the use of Jesus and Curton to the use of Lord. These and some other kindred facts, which my collation of the Syriac Gospels brought before me, are important. Do they not indicate that the texts of Lewis and of Curtin are not homogeneous, or at least that they have been subjected to a varying textual influence? Turning to the Peshitto problem, I should like to say in a few words how the case seems to me to stand. It is generally allowed, I believe by Dr. Sanday among others, that manuscripts and quotations carry back our knowledge of the Peshitto, roughly speaking, to the beginning of the 4th century, save for convenience, AD 310. And the question is, how and when did it come into existence? It would appear that there were, speaking broadly, only 2 alternatives containing 4 possibilities: revision and translation. It might then have been the result of the revision of previously existing Syriac texts, a revision conducted gradually, without any one authority, a revision extending over a long period of time, until at last the Peshitto, as we know it, was evolved. The objection to this theory seems to be that there are no traces of such a revision. If such a process has been gone through, it is next to certain that there will be extensive traces of it in the Peshitto manuscripts, traces of irregular revision and of mixture. And if anyone says, well, you have the antecedents of the Peshitto in Lewis and Curtin, that is not the point. The point is that no Peshitto manuscript shows any signs of mixture or of irregular revision. For Mr. Gwillim and the late Mr. Pusey appear to be quite correct in saying that the variations between Peshitto manuscripts are insignificant and are largely only slight changes in grammatical forms. This appears to be the place to remark that I cannot understand how anyone can suppose, in the language of Dr. Hort, that the Syriac version, like the Latin version, underwent revision long after its origin. The facts seem scarcely at all parallel. In the case of the Latin, there is historical evidence of revision. In the case of the Peshitto, none. In the case of the Latin, there are in existing manuscripts abundant traces of sporadic and casual mixture and of irregular revision. There is nothing of the kind in the Peshitto manuscript. Okay, Professor Sanday comes in next on this. Lord willing, I will continue this in the next video.